So, we all know what good characters are. They're the people you can count on to do good things, like risk their lives to protect others or bring pizza to a game session. Similarly, evil characters are those you can trust to do bad things, like murder innocent people or leave dislikes on my videos. But let me pose you a question. What makes neutral characters actually stand out? Sometimes, especially in the case of chaotic neutral characters, they're complete selfish maniacs, refusing to listen to anyone who doesn't offer them a reward, and killing anyone who slightly annoys them. The only thing that stops them from being obviously evil is the people that they're working with. Other times, there's nothing to distinguish neutral characters from good characters, other than maybe some superficial edginess. Your lawful good paladin is like, I've sworn before the gods to defend the innocent at all costs, and your lawful neutral paladin is like, I've sworn before the gods to defend the innocent at all costs, but I scowl while doing it. To be honest though, there's plenty of space for neutral characters to stand in besides basically evil and basically good. Ideally, neutral characters should have significant amounts of both good and evil inside of them. And in the context of an adventuring party, they'll probably be working for a good cause, but with motives and methods that are not necessarily good. Why is that relevant to the topic of this video? Because in order for the neutral characters to stand out, then the evil characters have to be solidly evil, and good characters have to be solidly good. And if you ask me, there are plenty of things that good adventurers do without thinking that I'd argue are pretty selfish or destructive. If good characters were to avoid the entries on this list, then they'd thematically stand out from their neutral party mates. And they could also engage in some very immersive arguments about whether the gains that come from looser morals are worth the risk of becoming just like the villains you strive to defeat. And as a DM, this list also might be useful to you in terms of setting up moral quandaries that the PCs might disagree on. So here we go. My first example of morally dubious behavior is probably the most important of all, and that's slaughtering hordes of minions. Obviously, in any D&D campaign, there'll be bad guys to fight, and plenty of those bad guys really do deserve to die, like the evil sorcerer who's orchestrating a genocide. Mindless undead and creatures like demons that are literally made of evil can also probably be killed without repercussion. But who's to say that a rank-and-file cult member or goblin raider is wicked through and through, and not just pressured to join the forces of darkness through an upbringing of ignorance? Sure, it's true that races like goblins and orcs are often described as being naturally inclined towards selfishness or brutality. But they aren't usually irredeemable, certainly not if those races are allowed as player characters. Plus, Wizards is quickly moving away from the idea of alignment being determined by race. The point is that it's difficult to tell whether a given sapient humanoid minion really deserves to die, so good characters should avoid killing them whenever possible. Sure, it may be inevitable that some minions will die, especially if the heroes are acting in self-defense, but the number of deaths will certainly be lowered if the heroes consider things like diplomacy, stealth, or non-lethal attacks. No matter how much more efficient it is, I think that killing sapient beings should be a last resort for good characters. Some people might argue that killing all of the bad guys is ultimately more good than giving them a second chance, given the belief that they're more likely to backstab the heroes than actually redeem themselves. I respectfully disagree. Neither of these options are evil, but I think that performing a preemptive strike is less humane than sparing someone who's already surrendered, especially if the person most threatened by leaving them alive is you. The next entry on my list is using enchantment spells, or any kind of mind manipulation in general. I'm not going to say whether or not free will technically exists, this isn't a philosophy class, but most people would argue that forcing people to do things is usually bad, and when examined logically, the knowledge that one's consciousness is being taken over and manipulated can lead to some serious emotional trauma. Plus, since mind control is less obviously harmful than something like a fireball, it's much more likely to tempt people into using it for purely selfish ends. If a character realizes how easy and painless it is to charm a guard to let them into a castle, then they can easily be tempted to rob shopkeepers of their hard-earned wealth by asking them to give stuff for free, or to get into bed with their crush without proper consent. Because of this, I would think that good characters should avoid using this type of magic, due to either a commitment to free will or the insight that any use of mind control will have negative consequences. That said, there are at least a couple of edge cases. Maybe your character is a wild magic sorcerer who's casting charm spells without even realizing it, in which case they aren't really accountable for their actions. And it's probably okay for anyone to use mind control to stop someone from immediately murdering people. But for the most part, good characters should rely on non-magical means of persuasion. Third on the list is grave robbing. Pretty much all adventurers will expect to find treasure during their quests, and many campaigns involve journeys into ancient temples or crypts, so it seems natural that the heroes will grab some old offerings to the gods in order to fund their future adventures. At the same time, that's kinda messed up. Unless your character is highly knowledgeable about the culture that the tomb came from, they're seriously disrespecting the people who toiled away building the place, and likely damaging the possibility of future archaeological discoveries. More importantly, pocketing those sacred offerings can have massively negative consequences in a setting where gods and the afterlife are provably real. Even if those diamonds you're stealing aren't dedicated to your god specifically, you can still be pulling someone out of heaven there. Fortunately, there are still plenty of ways to gain treasure that aren't morally compromising at all. A good character is probably fine with stealing offerings to a demon lord or similar evil entity, and just looting an enemy corpse doesn't have to be considered immoral either, although I could maybe see some paladins and monks swearing against it. But when it comes to stealing offerings to benevolent deities, then good characters should leave them alone out of caution that they might actually have some spiritual significance. My fourth entry isn't something that good characters should absolutely never do, but it's something that they should think twice about doing, and that's actively glorifying the monarchy and similar oppressive systems. Today, nearly all of us can agree that feudal monarchy is not a great system of government, and a character who actively prioritizes the well-being of the royal family above that of all others, or claims that royal blood is the only thing that determines a good leader, will look like more than a bit of an ass. Yes, in the real medieval world, there were plenty of good people who never opposed the monarchy because they'd never been exposed to concepts like liberty and human rights. And some players who are really into history might be able to fully immerse themselves in that medieval worldview. But for most groups, the campaign will involve enough anachronistic concepts that it'll be hard to shove aside the inherently oppressive nature of monarchical rule. If your characters all understand that women shouldn't be treated as property and that bloodletting isn't the best way to get rid of disease, then it's believable for them to grasp the concept of democracy. This isn't to say that every good character needs to be revolutionary. But if the characters are asked to go save the princess, a good character should ask themselves why saving the princess is more important than protecting everyone else. In the case of a lawful good character, then this can create an excellent conflict between the two sides of that alignment. And if a good aligned character happens to be royal or similarly privileged, then they should exercise some degree of humility. They certainly don't need to give up their throne, but they shouldn't see themselves as inherently superior to anyone else. And they should respect the ideas of peasants, even if their advisors call them crazy for it. So yeah, that's the list. You might be thinking that I've set a really high bar for good, and I don't blame you for thinking that. But for one thing, I'm not saying that a good aligned character can never do any of these things without falling to neutral. I'm just saying that they should think twice to consider whether it's really necessary. Also, keep in mind that this is fantasy we're talking about. People with strength and intelligence beyond believability are running around everywhere, so I don't think it's out of place for characters to have larger-than-life moral compasses as well. Sure, sometimes you'll want to run a dark campaign, where even the heroes will have to use unsavory methods to defeat even worse enemies, and nobody will qualify as good according to these rules. In that case, I recommend dropping alignment altogether. It has next to no mechanical significance in 5th edition, and unless your campaign is clearly about good versus evil, it'll just cause confusion at your table. But if it is about good versus evil, then I think there should be a clear distinction between characters with noble goals and admirable methods, and those with noble goals who resort to more questionable methods. If anyone has a differing opinion on anything I've discussed, or their own anecdotes of war crimes committed by player characters, then I'm happy to discuss those in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.